Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
In this episode of the Super Urban Podcast, we focus on Adelaide, a city of clarity, streets framed by gardens, squares laid out with foresight, a river threading quietly through civic life. Unlike other Australian settlements born from penal colonies or ports, Adelaide was conceived as a civic experiment, a city designed to reflect ideals, not just occupation. Colonel William Light imagined a place that was orderly, hygienic and morally structured, yet flexible enough to grow with its people. Families of Scots, Cornish and German Lutherans brought non-conformist values, a commitment to education, hard work and collaborative progress, embedding these ideals into the city's very fabric. Adelaide earned the nickname the City of Firsts. It was the first to grant women the vote and parliamentary representation, the first Australian state to appoint an Indigenous governor, Sir Douglas Nicholls, a city where civic ambition, social reform, and the belief that architecture and planning could shape not just space, but culture itself, came together in an elegant urban template. Today, we explore Adelaide, its stories, its architecture, its evolving identity, through the eyes of an architect whose work has both shaped and been shaped by this remarkable city.
So joining us today is Ian McDougall, co-founder and director of ARM Architecture, whose work has shaped cultural and civic life across Australian cities. ARM's architecture is very much a narrative-rich, provocative and civic-minded kind of architecture, carrying memory and fostering engagement. Ian's career at ARM Architecture includes working on seminal projects like the Marion Cultural Centre, which we'll talk about later in the show, in Adelaide, the Melbourne Recital Centre, the Sydney Opera House Concert Hall renewal, the Geelong Arts Centre redevelopment, just to name a few, each demonstrating architecture's role as a civic instrument, a cultural platform and a space for community interaction. In addition, Ian co-founded Transition Journal in 1979 with Richard Munday, a publication dedicated to exploring architecture as a medium for public discourse, reflecting on past mistakes, shaping ideas for the future of our cities. Ian and Richard were friends in Adelaide, and together they left in 1976 to continue their architecture studies at RMIT in Melbourne, attracted by Graham Gunn's leadership there during the time. Ian's work through his role as co-founder and director of ARM Architecture demonstrates that architecture is political, it is civic, and it is culturally generative, a medium that engages citizens and shapes the collective life of the city. Welcome, Ian.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, welcome Ian McDougall, because we have two Ians in the room on occasion. Perhaps we can start talking about cities like Adelaide through direct experience, through memory and everyday life. You've got this vast body of work in many cities, but grew up in Adelaide or grew up in South Australia. Perhaps we can talk about that through the Festival Plaza Master Plan, where you're sort of bringing a whole cultural identity to Adelaide, and often Adelaide's talked about as a place where people leave, like a lot of sort of second-tier size cities near a bigger city. A lot of people have left there to come to Melbourne, for example. Perhaps we can talk about this sort of process of bringing Adelaide its own identity and what architecture can do for that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I grew up in a country town outside of Adelaide, but it was close enough to go in on the train so you could go to the Maya cafeteria and have a pie. That was a big day. But you would actually travel through the sort of countryside, the farmland, and then you would hit the new satellite city of Elizabeth, and then you would hit Adelaide. And that's a kind of an encapsulation of Adelaide's history in its sense of itself as the sort of old Colonel Light centre, and then the new city, post-war city, and the country. And I mean, the Adelaide has an ambience of being. It's a prosperous city. It's clean, compared to when you look at other cities. You think, wow, this is when you go there now. And it's also kind of got a sort of a, what would you call it? It's a kind of slower sense of itself, but it's not provincial. It's very cultured and culturally conscious. I mean, the Adelaide Festival is probably one of the great art festivals of the world. So it's very... Wome Adelaide, the whole of that sort of celebration of performance art is very strong. And that sense of it, it's hard to try and work out why it's like that, but it has got a very strong confidence about itself, but at the same time, are constantly self-defending. When the Crows are playing anyone else, if someone gets a kick, everyone boos. So there's a sense of its self-pride. But you mentioned the fact that it was a real estate. It's set up as a real estate deal, and so people would buy and then come and settle. But then at the same time, there was no free labour. There were no convicts. So there was assisted passage to come out for people from my family came from Scotland, but particularly Scottish and Lutheran. Now, if you get the two Calvinist groups together, there is not a lot of dancing, but there is a lot of, as you said, absolute belief in good works, absolute belief in education. And education everywhere. It's not not like the Anglican ascendancy. It's across the board. Everybody gets educated. And so that's very strong, and that sort of sense of culture. And that continues. At the same time, it was then established as a city by old families, the Oafs, the old Adelaide families. And so the heirs, the elders, the Bar Smiths, Elder Smith, the Duttons, the Hawkers, all of these old families, and many of them, including the later ones like the Benythans, were still in power in the 1940s. So their families, and that stability actually meant that the city isn't a boom and bust city. It still isn't a boom and bust city. And that stability, on the one hand, it's conservative, but on the other hand, because of the reformists, they're all, as you said, reform free thinkers, that reformist idea is embedded in those families. Those families were huge philanthropists, and they built the library, and they built the museum, and they built the university, all of that sort of thing. So it's kind of that sense of it being a benefactor ascendancy is very strong. And I think that still exists, but it probably shifted in the 70s under Don Dunstan and the rise of Labor. I can verge into politics here because the previous Premier, Tom Playford, who was the longest-serving elected, I think in what was the Commonwealth, the longest-serving politician, he was what would you call him, a conservative socialist, because he got Holden's, he got the shipbuilding going, the state-owned electricity, the state housing trusts, which is an absolute lesson, and more contemporary people should look at how this SA Housing Trust worked. At one stage, I think they owned something like 35 or 40% of the land in South Australia, and therefore there was no boom in land prices because it would just gradually release and develop public housing, which then the community would rent and then had the option to buy. So they were and that's up until the 70s.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not rocket science, is it? You just wonder, all these discussions we're having now about housing, and here we have a very good example of it in Adelaide.
Yeah. And, I mean, the interesting spin-off of that is the current Premier of South Australia, a really brilliant politician. His father worked at the South Australian Housing Trust. So that that line of social or community action is embedded in South Australia.
It's just great to talk about a city where you can really you're talking about the DNA really of the city,
Yeah.
that really persists. Also interested the way you're talking about hitting Adelaide. It's going to coming in from the country. So the first time I experienced Adelaide was on a train from Perth, changing trains to come to Melbourne. But you could really read the sense of an oasis. I mean, this sort of grid surrounded by green space and really, the stability, you described the stability, is sort of really instantly visible.
Yeah, that. There's a lot of argument about Colonel Light's plan, but it's a pretty good plan. It's a terrific plan. In fact, the town I grew up in, the central section of it, was laid out by Light as well, and it was a grid, and it had the Anglican Church in the central common, and the Catholic Church at the end of the main axis, and then so very. I think there's a sense of what would you call it, order, form, structure that then has an equity to it, a quality to it, and I think that is really strong. The positives and negatives about such stability. One of the positives was they're very strong conservation, enlightened conservation laws, but very strict laws, so that the city fabric has actually stayed very intact. So the sort of sense, so there hasn't been encroachments or very few encroachments into the parklands. That green belt still exists, even though they have the supercar track on one side of it, and the train station is on one bit of it. And so that city plan idea it might have been the 70s or 80s was quite strict. It wasn't the first, because a lot of that stuff, actually, the conservation and the strictness of the conservation comes from Melbourne, I think, from memory. But Melbourne being a boom town, it had struggled to. So you get that sort of, you can have 3 buildings on Collins Street, but the rest of it will bugger up. But Adelaide was very strict, and that's on the other hand, it meant that in the 60s, 70s. There wasn't a lot of work and so the conservatism sort of embedded itself in the architectural culture, which the negative of there's no dancing with the Calvinists meant that sort of wacky architecture, messy vitality, didn't get a foothold. And that period, there's a couple of things that happened. One was a number of Adelaide firms decided to be corporate. So you had Hassel, Woods Bagot
to go to other cities,
and would spread across Australia and would offer the full, landscape, project management, all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, one-stop shop. Yeah. And so that Woodhead and Cheeseman, the great architect Jack McConnell, who came to Melbourne, came from Melbourne actually, and then went to Adelaide and worked there. Set up Hassel McConnell, or actually Claridge Hassel McConnell, and that group then turned into the corporate group that we know as Hassel, and so because it's corporate, that idea about a design studio wasn't the case, so it actually put a flattener on, I think, from probably 1970 through the 70s. Really up until more recent times, that there wasn't a lot of experimental work. It was kind of architecture as a service, and the language and the identity was irrelevant. It was just...
it's a really clear description of thinking of a city as an ongoing, uncertain and messy experiment versus one where you get the template and it's very clear and well conceived, but sort of stifles things. So then ARM come back and do some master planning work in Adelaide?
Well, the work we did on the river edge for the river, the Torrens Lake edge, well, really from bridge to bridge, actually. So it wasn't just the Festival Plaza. We did some master planning all the way along there. And it was based on trying to rediscover the edge, or also make a little narrative about the city itself. There was some when we first did it, we found, in fact, that it was actually quite a sacred spot in Ghana culture. So the two, I hope I've got this right from memory, the Victoria Square, which is the centre of the city, which Light made as the centre of the city, was the I think the women's sacred location, and the River Edge was the men's sacred location. And where Parliament House is right now is actually an ochre, like the ground dye that they used in ceremonies. It's underneath there. Interestingly, that the government would then say, well, why don't we put Parliament right on top of this very sacred site? And then they mined the stone, to build the first Anglican church. And we said, we need to mark this, and it wasn't well received by, they didn't want to do it. They said, no, the Parliament's already there. We'll put we'll put an Indigenous artwork in the paving. Maybe it's a little disrespectful. Anyway, but that particular, the process of revealing various aspects to the site, including the way that the river had changed, including entertaining the idea that they could actually, and in fact this wasn't us, this was a hydrologist who worked there, who'd been discovering how you could remake it not as an English lake, but as what it was originally, a chain of ponds, or springs, and then the edges of wetland, and try and reintroduce sections of it that were like the Torrens actually was then. That, interestingly, that they wouldn't do that, but interestingly, that idea and that guy's ideas about how you can make it work as a wetland is still around. It's still being discussed. I think eventually it might happen. But sorry, I got distracted there. But the idea of actually trying to reveal the history of that section, and then also, the master plan then turned into the Festival Plaza. And the Festival Plaza, then we tried to merge some of those ideas with the Hassel the building, and to sort of blur the two sections, and then use a landscape TCL to almost like a series of specimen plants, the pepper tree, the jacarandas, the garden shrubs that are really common in Adelaide, and bring them onto the site. So in some way trying to find aspects of tropes of Adelaide's culture through the marking out of the paving, through the way that the plantings are set up, all that sort of thing, including the beautiful TCL came up with this amazing basket range. It's a beautiful stone from the Adelaide Hills, which is used on the front of 50s and 60s houses in that sort of freestone. They made a beautiful wall along the front to capture that sense of, well, these are all Adelaide elements. These are all Adelaideness. So the attempt to work with the material that's there was really what we were trying to do.
I mean, I really like the phrase, the messy vitality and Adelaideness, are used in the kind of same sort of context, because I think what you've described really is a really compelling sort of narrative about, I guess, how this idea of, new models of ownership or citizenship and sovereignty sort of are then translated into, the form of the city and its plan, and, thinking about how that civicness sort of creates, a very particular kind of city. And you've described also how your how ARM sort of projects try to, respond to those existing conditions and, contextual sort of narratives. Do you still see Light's civic experiment resonating within the present day identity of the city?
I think, absolutely. It's still embedded there, and it's still contentious. The contention of Light was the son of a English officer and a woman who was Penang, Malay. Of course, the portraits that are painted of him, he looks very white, but he was, he's so that like that sense of what's the word? Like a progressive, multicultural identity of a city is, I think that's still really strong. And it's like, Melbourne's got that same sense, but it's expressed differently in Adelaide. There is this, there's a gentility to it and an intellectualism to it that is not as divided. I mean, Melbourne's culture, to me, is, Bob Menzies and the union movement. It's very split.
Culture wars.
But Adelaide, they're all blended, what's his name? Don Dunstan's radicalism is blended by the fact that he came from the, he went to St. Peter's and he used to consult with Playford about what he should do. They were, the radical and the conservative are blended.
Right.
Yet you come along and work on this Riverside project and also the Showgrounds master plan, which does seem like, you mentioned that there was some sort of tension and perhaps resistance to some of the ideas within it. Do you think that, attention to wanting to maintain the integrity of Light's vision and so forth, is that starting to change? Like, given that we've seen projects like ARM's the River Project, and
I think the tension is still there. One of the great things that also allowed Adelaide to, loosen its belt was the influx of Italian and Greek.
Yes,
like
I
the
wondered
huge,
that.
yeah. And in fact, interestingly, I think I go back to that period of the 70s, 80s, where I think architecture just kind of died in Adelaide. You had the beautiful work that Dixon and Platten did. Absolutely. I will mention Dixon Platten, who did work in the 70s and 80s. But so at the time when it was corporatised, Dixon and Platten, Bob Dixon and Newell Platten, did really beautiful work. Newell Platten did some study, what's the name of the Doxiadis? Under Doxiadis, and also did a lot of, European study. And Bob Dixon was in Italy at the time in the 50s when there was the big antagonism between modernism and the Italians. They established the work which I think really captures a whole influence of what Adelaide is like. It's kind of classical, but it's not classical. The materiality of it is not timber. It's not a temporariness. It's monumentality. So it's the brickwork that they use, that raw brickwork.
Definitely a sense of the civic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's civic and the domestic that
And
overlap.
yeah.
The union building that they did is absolutely brilliant. And they were drawn into the Sydney School. They're nothing to do with the Sydney School. They're more to do with the Italian movements and European movements that were going on at the time. They had straw ceilings, those fabulous straw ceilings.
So was that the Union Hall at the university that was under threat of demolition?
Yes.
I did want to come to that because, you mentioned conservation and heritage. And I guess Adelaide's architecture, like many contemporary cities at the moment, also reflects that tension between both heritage and new innovation. And of course, ARM's designed for the Marion Cultural Centre, and we'll come back to that in more detail soon, but that you did in collaboration with Phillips Pilkington. That was a project that's also very narrative rich, driven architecture. It's got a civic presence and so forth. before we get to the Marion, I mean, how do you feel about how Adelaide is handling its heritage? And of course, I just mentioned the Union Hall. The hall was removed from the Heritage Register, I believe, recently to allow for a $77 million science precinct to be built in its place. How well do you think Adelaide is travelling at the moment in terms of achieving that balance between maintaining its cultural heritage and also allowing for new innovation and architecture?
Well, the union, I mean, that was terrible. That was a disgrace for the way that happened. And a university should hang their head on that. The remnants, the resistance, what's the word? The inertia that the conservation, the conservation is hanging on by the inertia of the rules that are there, but it is under threat. You're right, and I mean partly also one of the conditions, like Melbourne, never got rid of its trams because it just forgot to do it.
Yeah.
Is
that why?
Got too lazy. What's wrong with them? Everybody else got rid of them.
And they brought them back.
Yeah, that's right. At a huge expense. The what's the word? The loss of an architectural vitality from 60s on, say, it's also because the economy it didn't have the pressures. There wasn't nobody's building headquarters there. But at the same time, there isn't also that speculative. There isn't the boom city tradition that Melbourne has.
Yeah.
The job that's never finished. Adelaide had that sense that no, it's pretty good as it is, and we'll only make the change if we think it's actually a better change, and we'll reuse stuff. The east end of Rundle Street was a huge success in terms of just keeping the existing fabric. The market closed, and then they built some not great architectural outcome, but it didn't bugger up that end of the city. Now there are more pressure on places to, commercialise pressures. So and that's happened over the last probably 15 years or maybe a little bit more, where sections of it that have just we're getting our international, no place commercialisation in there, and also the interests are using out of Adelaide designs, so Sydney designers and Melbourne designers. So there is pressure. I think you're right. There is, and they had a system. They had a very strong planning system, which has been eroded a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The music from our sound break just now comes from Vietnam's Run Cup Doi collective from the 2023 collection called One. That's track 2, and it's a piece called What Cherubs.
So back to the Marion Cultural Centre, another ARM designed building in Adelaide, which was astonishingly almost demolished, and thankfully there was a huge campaign and now it's on the Heritage Register. But I want to talk a little bit about that. Tell us about the place in which it is sited, Marion, and what the intent of the design was in terms of sort of providing that civic urban identity.
Well, the Marion Cultural Centre as a project was a Marion City Council's desire to have an art gallery, a little performance theatre and a central library. All of those things had been in their own buildings. The gallery was in an old house. Anyway, the desire to build a new library and anchor it with these other facilities. Marion had demolished or vacated the city, their original town hall, and that was no longer there. So the identity of Marion was like a rented office building. That's where you went and paid your parking fines, etc. in the southern suburbs of Adelaide. And it's a classic, outer suburb, especially in the hot plains of Adelaide, or it feels a bit like Perth too. So the identity of the suburb was pretty blurry. You didn't really, am I in Marion yet? Except for the huge shopping centre. So the Marion Shopping Centre, which was the biggest one in Adelaide, Westfield, that was the identity. That was, everybody went, we're going down to Marion. Are you going shopping? No, I'm just going to the suburb. And right next door was this tiny little community centre. Within the car park, there had been a little bit of land that hadn't been sold out, so it was in the sort of tarmac of the car park. So we had to give it a sort of presence. Oh, and the other thing was there was a hill. I think it was about 8 metres high, the hill. So in the flat plains, and there'd been an old house on there, and it had been demolished, but the fence was still there, the stone fence. So the idea that it would be on this knoll and get the presence from its about 4 metre high by the time you build the building, and give it some sense of roadside, because it's also that thing of when you drive out of every Australian city, you drive past the car yards, the big box, it's just the streets in Adelaide, because they're on the grid, they're very long and straight, so you're just driving for miles, car yard, Bunnings. And so somehow it had to get some presence as a roadside thing. So we started with the idea it's like a petrol station. It should have that sort of sense of it's on this, I'm over here. And of course we liked the idea. There's a great Red Russia painting of those petrol stations with the stand. So we said, why don't we try and do it like that as an extruded thing with its name right up the front, Marion. So that was the design.
So it's a bit like a new take on the town hall as being the servo or the almost.
And it's roadside.
The roadside.
As you approach a town, you see the big sign saying "Welcome to Marion."
Yeah. So there's links to Venturi, obviously. Yeah. But that roadside aspect to it, so that area was the area next to the shopping centre. It was empty essentially. It was a car park. So to get that sense of it being okay, that's the shopping centre. Oh, that's the other main building in the town. I
mean, for those who don't know the building, it's probably worth describing a little bit, because you make this amazingly sculptural thing out of what you're describing as a sign. But if you think about Venturi's binary of a duck and a decorated shed, it completely dissolves that. That it's kind of
it's all mushed into.
Yeah. It's kind of both at once.
Yeah. I mean that. Yeah.
Well, I thought you were going to expand that, so perhaps you should, Ian. But the words Marion are used to become the sign and extruded to become a big sort of three-dimensional. Well, the letters actually become the building because they're extruded and wrap around.
So and in fact it's MAR.
MAR, yes.
Is the big front, big steel letters. They're 5 meters high, something like that. And then the I is a sculpture by Greg Johns, and then the O is a garden paved element, a garden bed, and then the N is a trellis that things grow on, and then there's a plaza, and it does a sort of a shake, which is a little like the move of a river or the move of a flow. Of course, you can't see my hand movements here, but it sort of meanders back to the other end, and it gets cut off because it meanders. So where it gets cut off, it gets arches and things that you can get into. There's, maybe there's a little recollection of a Roy Grounds in the arch entry, and there's a Roy Grounds ceiling in there too, and it's two-tiered because we could get a little bit of height out of the fact that part of it was on the knoll. So when you come in, it's got a kind of civic quality, but effectively it's a row of shops because there's the library, there's the that faces the side off the MAR, which faces the main highway. The side section is library, then the next shop is the entry and the cafe, and then the next shop is the gallery. So it's like a strip shop.
Well, thanks for expanding on that description, which I should have kept going with. But also, I mean, what you've described is this kind of big project which lots of us have been interested in, is making urbanism, to use that word, out of something which could have completely avoided the question. And the description of approaching Marion, which had kind of been given up as a sort of an urban centre. Yeah, well, that's working with Phillips Pilkington too, because they're there on the ground. I mean, I'd known them for a long time, and in fact, they're one of the group who have emerged. Nick Tridenti, Phillips Pilkington. I'll come back to Troppo, but who have been absolutely self-conscious about. Okay, Adelaide has a culture. We will document it. Michael Pilkington's been instrumental in us affirming the ongoing register of 20th century modern and postmodern buildings, significant buildings, and getting the Institute to be the endorser of that. At the same time as University of South Australia has a really good museum of local architectural documentation. So the group that come probably out of the 80s, maybe the 90s, have been more self-conscious about that, and so working with them, it was a great sounding between us to work out first of all, Marion didn't have identity. I mean, they affirmed that, and they'd been doing some work in some park nearby, and that issue came up all the time about, well, what is Marion? It's just doesn't have any. It's just a blur. So that was a self-consciousness that we pursued. Yeah, it's a very particular self-consciousness too, because you can imagine trying to affirm the identity of Adelaide and sort of focusing on the historical centre and so on, but these blurring kind of peripheries.
Up until maybe you had a stronger assertion of Mediterranean immigration, it was very Anglo, or very, very not Anglican, but very
Anglo-Celtic.
Yeah. And so the affirmation of it being more complicated than that is that consciousness has come through. It's the consciousness is there in asserting confidence about it. I don't see it yet in the architecture. But I mentioned Troppo. Now, Troppo are very important architects. Phil Harris and the gang, when they graduated from Adelaide University, then took a road trip. I don't know. It's well documented, isn't it? And wrote a book on, and it was a funny little self-published documentation of their trip about Australian architectural culture in the vernacular, and how it linked to culture and climate and that sort of thing. And their work, I think, exhibits an interesting stream of Adelaide architecture, which is not formalist. It's technical, particularly related to climate and how climate equals authentic architecture. Interestingly, one of the first people to espouse a similar sort of what would you call it? Sort of concern with the landscape, that sort of thing, was Peter Muller, who is an Adelaide architect, who then goes on to really be one of the key issues in Sydney. And he was very interested in the 40s in this sort of idea of how you make things out of raw materials, the timber, the brick, and then that gets passed on because Adelaide University was very strong on building science and all of the forget about style. We want to know the insulation rating on that wall, and so Troppo come from that tradition, which is about making buildings that sit within their location, and their response to the climate becomes their identity. And you look at, and they also were one of the first people to work with Indigenous participation, and so they're very successful in Northern Territory and Northern Queensland, even though they still in Adelaide. Their challenge is that their work doesn't transfer into the urban environment. It's difficult to do that. They got messy vitality. Boy, some of that's pretty messy because it's so aformal. But when it comes into the city, but they are very important in Australian architectural terms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's maybe a good segue, almost by accident, to talk about the word salubrity. It comes up in the formation of Adelaide. So part of sort of the instructions for the planning is a beautiful and salubrious city. But this idea of planning a city for health, and the idea that beauty and health are completely conflated in 19th century urban planning is interesting in relation to what you just said. And then we've got these contemporary climate change challenges and the kind of all that growing body of knowledge about the health of a sprawling city, or the ill health of a sprawling city.
That's true, and there is a very strong emphasis on environmental responsibility through the work, through the work that goes really from the 80s, because of that. I think also because of that influence of the building science consciousness. But at the same time, you're just getting works that are done, which are done like everywhere in the world. They're full of air conditioning, and there's a what's it called? Not tokenistic, a lip service sort of process in it. I mean, the interesting thing with Marion is that it was a very, at the time, there's an aquifer under there, so the plaza actually, all the water's collected and goes into the aquifer, and then that water is then used for the, within the structure, not in the drinking water, but in the other areas. And then also it was one of the first buildings that we'd done where it was naturally ventilated with mechanical systems that said, well, it's okay outside. So the windows would open automatically, and the one section was evaporative cooling, which you can use in Adelaide because it's so dry, and the other sections like the library and the gallery and the theatre were fully air conditioned because they needed it for the gallery. So it was a hybridized environmental process to try and get, and that comes from, I think, the influence of Phillips Pilkington's consciousness about, well, this is what Adelaide's like. We can temper the amount of energy we use and manage the thing from an environmentally responsible way. So I think that is important. I think it hasn't been, well, maybe I'm a bit out of touch there now, but I haven't seen it shift into really heavily off-grid style, but maybe it has, I don't know.
South Australia's grid generally, broadly, is really advanced now. I mean, when they're getting to 100% renewable.
Already. So that's that progressive thing. I mean, the progressive thing was one thing. They sold all their power plants to a Chinese company that kept shutting them down. They had not very good coal, brown coal, which is really dirty. So they shut that down quite quickly, and then were very early adopters on batteries and wind and solar and big farms. Ooh. Yeah. So that's. I mean, that's that.
Despite being mocked by Scott Morrison for it.
Yeah. That's right.
One of the points that you described really well with the Marion Cultural Centre was, I guess, this idea of the peri-urban and road town and how architecture sort of starts to become a kind of exaggeration in those realms, and how you have to almost develop a new set of principles to deal with those sites. It also perhaps is a way to segue to talk about maybe Elizabeth, where you mentioned that earlier as well, and that being one of Adelaide's sort of industrial satellites, and was created as a car city for Holden workers. And like many suburbs, it also reflects Australia's post-war industrial ambitions, but now sort of faces challenges of fostering community, culture, and perhaps even civic engagement. It also has a strong reference to the rock legend Jimmy Barnes, who sort of put Elizabeth in the spotlight when he wrote about his tough upbringing there in his 2016 book, The Working Class Boy. So ARM's projects often explore the periphery as sort of opportunity, where it's sort of turning edges and suburbs into cultural and social nodes rather than mere residential sprawl, as we've seen in the case with the Marion Cultural Centre. How do you think suburbs like Elizabeth, or what role do you think suburbs like Elizabeth play today, socially and architecturally? And how can these areas evolve into more active cultural hubs and centres that, rather than just being sort of dormitory towns?
That's a good point to raise. So I hope I get this right. I think the roots of the satellite town, Elizabeth, and the idea of setting it up as a place for worker, and that goes back to the 19th century, Robert Owen or whatever, Sunshine Soap. But that idea of it as a place where the city would be described as an economic unit. So it had that thing about, first of all, it was a place for migrants and also for workers, and you could rent and then you could buy. That system worked. It had a town centre, like a kind of Barkima, English New Town sort of feel to it. But the main difference was, I think it's Hugh Stretton's idea about the suburb as everybody's little, you can grow your own veggies in the house lot. And so that as a model, and there are still valid arguments for that system as a viable and healthy settlement pattern. So that's as a model, I think that's a really advanced idea. Where it struggles is, and it struggled. I mean, I grew up in a housing trust house in outside a country town, just at the edge of a country town, and the density is very low, and you're not in the centre. So that's one of the problems. And I'll tell this story because I like the story. So the friends that as a teenager, I grew up with. One of my best friends was Frank Kurzel. The Kurzels lived across in the other section of the Housing Commission area, and the Kurzels go on to make amazing film about the bodies in the barrels, which is about Smithfield, the areas on the periphery of Elizabeth, and the sort of terrible conditions people live under and those sort of. So this model is the same. It's a house on a block or a duplex on 2 blocks, and backyard. The backyard's sort of desert. Front yard's got an old car body in it, and so that's sort of the other end of the story of Elizabeth is the end of the sort of the disadvantaged and disenfranchised that live out and haven't got jobs, they're living on the sort of welfare and whatever. That's the bad side of that system, because the densities are so low. There's no services, there's no shops. They can't be, and we see that now in the western suburbs. I mean that was in Adelaide. Elizabeth was state set up. The systems that we have now, which are rolling out, serviceless suburbs in the west, have the same issues. They don't even have a backyard, unfortunately. So, at least if you wanted to grow veggies in Smithfield, you could. But so that the model of Elizabeth still has lessons for everyone, but it was too simple. I worked at the Housing Trust when I was at uni, and we did, here's the template, there's the school, and there's the neighbourhood unit number 33, and then there's another neighbourhood unit number 33, and it just rolls out. It was too simple. There was no medium density. There was no connection to service, no shops. The school was the centre. The shops were somewhere else. So the planning of that stuff now needs to be much more complicated to allow for different ways of living rather than that one model.
Programs.
Yeah, mixing program, which I think everybody knows that now, but whether it's delivered.
Exactly.
It is a good story. And you're talking about the film Snowtown, eh?
Yeah.
Which is, for those who haven't seen it, warn you ahead of time. It is very grim, not just for what happens, but you're right, the depiction of an urban experiment gone wrong.
Yeah.
But as you say, nevertheless, it was a valid urban experiment.
Yeah. And the idea that everybody wants to live in medium density, it's not right.
No.
But it's almost like you need to revisit the structure of. It's almost like reinvent the garden city. That sort of pattern of core, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. We did, we've talked about Sydney with Elizabeth Farrelly in the previous episode, and she also notes an interesting point about some types of these particular types of development where you don't get you only inherit the problems of low density without its benefits, and I think that's a really interesting kind of correlation about even talking about high density where you get all the kind of the issues without the benefits of it because of how development is sort of delivered. Yeah.
Well, the high density, we're only now starting to learn of the high density problems. I mean, people predicted this, but now it's become explicit because if the buildings aren't well built, there's a problem with getting them fixed up because it's got a body corporate structure. The body corporate doesn't want to do anything. I don't want to pay for that guy's window. And all of that system is just, it's a disaster.
Absolutely.
And so, the value of apartments has just gone bang down because people are going, hang on, this is not actually the episode of Friends that we wanted to live in.
Yeah, well, it's a lesson in sort of learning how to collectivise some bit of the housing model.
So there's financial and commercial structures that dictate a lot of that, but to try and bring it back to a more usable model,
We are running out of time, but I did want to leave on a discussion around future Adelaide, and of course, I think it was at 2017 the government released the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. Do you know much about that? I think the idea was there was ambitions for 30-year plan for Adelaide that includes transit-orientated development, affordable housing strategies, green canopy extension, activation of cultural corridors. Have you looked into?
I haven't. Although what you're saying there sounds very, generic, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the interesting thing with Adelaide is the grid is big enough for it to be a medium to low density residential with a high density residential and commercial section. It hasn't got the grid is the central grid, of which Adelaide maintains its identity from, other than the suburban identity, is, and because it faces parkland, it can be commercial and residential in an old 19th century way, or mood, rather than a Manhattan, and so some of that stuff like transport. What was it? I've forgotten that term.
Transport orientated development.
TODs. That's right,
Good
TODs.
old
Bring them back. Well, you're there. Get a bit more inventive, guys. Like, really. I think one of the universities have been very interesting. Adelaide University, old, group of 8 university, and it had a period with the building science, had David Saunders as history, so it didn't have a strong design thing. And then Uni SA, which grew a very strong history of architecture, particularly local history, local design, and then also design. A lot of the good designers that are around now have come out of that. And they're merging. That university is merging into one university. So it'll be very interesting to see how that impacts and whether the urban design side of it will actually come up, because it's been left to planning to be the urban design. People like Judith Bryan, who was a professor at Adelaide Uni, very astute, was on the Adelaide review panels for many years to try and make sure that the spirit of it all was retained. Well, those people aren't around anymore, and so it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of that from the sort of cultural milieu of the merged uni.
I think we're going to move to a close, but that's been a really fascinating conversation. It's amazing how much we've sort of drawn out of Adelaide. None of us are experts on the city, so it's really great to hear from you. And it was really interesting to hear this conversation about this kind of combination of socially progressive and kind of very stable kind of both urban fabric and kind of government of the city. It's really, really interesting. And the sense of how this makes its way into your projects, into other people's projects. It's been really great to hear you sort of talking about cities made through stories, the stories of migration, stories of colonialism, pre-colonial stories sort of being rediscovered. And this idea of sort of Adelaide being a city of first, but also sort of kind of slightly outside the kind of narratives that dominate in Melbourne and Sydney, perhaps.
Yeah.
So thank you again. It's been really marvellous to hear all that.
No, thank you. We didn't even get to mention the wine industry.
We didn't. No, we steered clear
which
of
is,
And Alexander Downer didn't get a mention either.
in his his family's big house. Got Don. You've got to have Don, and he's the genius.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes. All
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.